During the Civil War and right after, America was changing a lot, and this unit is going to focus a lot on that. This particular slideshow will focus on the western part where not very many people were living yet. So in order to talk about the West, we kind of need to define what it is. It was called the frontier, the Western frontier. Frontier being a place where just not very many people were, and it stretched all the way from the Mississippi River all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. So right down the middle of the country, right through Minnesota and down, and then all the way west, all the way to the edge of California. And so that was what the West was. And the West was covered, a large, large area covered in prairies, which are kind of grasslands, like up in this picture up here, okay, as well as mountains and forests for them to be used by the people. And so the people that were already living there at this moment were the Native Americans, and they had been living there for a very, very long time. The Mexican settlers who had lived there back when it was part of Mexico, and then also the pioneers. And the pioneers were the new people. They were the Americans that had come out and were looking for some sort of opportunity. And we'll talk about a lot of little opportunities that they were looking for. A lot of times they were trying to get themselves a piece of land. But these pioneers were out here. But the West, it was kind of seen, they called it the Great American Desert. It was seen as useless land, as land that you really couldn't do much with. Okay, and so it was considered an unsettled land. Not very many people were really living there. But after the Civil War, people started to look for new land. They needed a new place to be. And so there are a whole lot of different reasons for people to start moving out there, but a lot of people started to move out to the West soon after the Civil War ended. And really the first group to populate the West were the miners, and they were the gold rushers. And so this happened before the Civil War. We already talked about it a little bit, but in 1849 there was a gold rush that brought tons and tons of people out to California. And a bunch of different towns popped up around the different areas wherever gold was found. If there was gold found in a river or gold found in a mountain, pretty quickly a town would pop up near there. And that town would stay in business and get bigger and bigger and bigger until that mountain or that stream or whatever it was ran out of gold. And so mining towns were popping up all over California. And if you know football, if you know the NFL, it's easy to remember what date the gold rush was, because there's a football team named after them, and that's the San Francisco 49ers. So the 49ers are named after the people who came out in 1849 looking for gold. And so that's just kind of the origin of that football team's name. But anyways, we'll talk about one particular area where they found some gold, and that was called the Comstock Lode. Okay, and a lode is just a vein, like almost like a vein under your skin, but it's a vein of stuff under the earth that is like really rich in gold or silver or iron or something like that. That's what a lode is. And so these two Irishmen came in and they found this vein of gold. Okay, and they were so excited and said, we found this gold in 1859 in the Sierra Nevada mountains out there. But Henry Comstock came in and he said, excuse me, it's not your gold, because this is my land. I own this land, so I own all the gold on it as well. And so he ended up getting all of this wealth was his to get. And so what he did is he started to bring in all the equipment to mine the gold and to get the gold out of there. But there was this huge issue because there was this blue sand hanging out that was around there, and every time it rained, every time it got wet from the chemicals and equipment and stuff like that, turned into this nasty mucky mud, and the mud would clog up all the machines, and it was really, really hard to get anything out of the ground because all the machines were being ruined by this weird blue sand. Well, what he didn't know at the time was that this blue sand was blue because it was just full of pieces of silver. And so the blue sand was actually very, very valuable itself, and they ended up throughout the years getting about $300 million worth of silver out of this Comstock lode. And this was in an area called Virginia City, Nevada. And in Virginia City, Nevada, the people that were coming out to mine here, the people that were working his land for him, put up a new tent city, and it quickly turned into a boom town. However, with all the silver there and everything like that, they didn't know that was there. And so Comstock quickly acted to get rid of this really difficult land. So we know about the Comstock lode, but in other areas there were valuable ores being found as well, all over the West. In Alaska, in the Black Hills of South Dakota, there was gold being found in all of these different areas, and there was lots of excitement, and people would rush out there, but not a ton of people made a whole lot of money off of it because it was really hard to get to it. It was really, really deep. You needed expensive equipment, you needed explosives, you needed people. It was just really, really hard to get your hands on this gold. It was really dug down deep in there. And so Comstock, knowing his whole issue with that blue mud mucking up everything, he decided that he was going to sell the rights to mine his land. So he thought, I can't get anything out of this. It's not worth it. I'm spending too much money, and so I'm going to sell the rights to mining on my land. And he sold the rights to his land for $11,000 and 2 mules. So a mule's kind of like a donkey and a horse mixed. And so for $11,000 and 2 donkeys, he sold $300 million worth of silver, and however much the gold was worth it was on there too. So he kind of ended up, even though he didn't know it, getting a pretty bad deal there. And like I said, the city that was near him and all these different cities that were popping up, they had a special name to them. They were called boom towns. And in boom towns, they all of a sudden, there'd be a bunch of miners that would come out, and they wouldn't have anywhere to live, anywhere to buy meals, anywhere to do anything. And so all of a sudden buildings would start popping up, like restaurants and hotels and stuff like that. And so these towns just showed up overnight. They really, really quickly showed up. And like I said, there were hotels, stores, restaurants, bars for drinking, all kinds of different stuff. And so what ended up happening is a lot of the people that owned these or ran them were women. And so women got really, really rich. And the women were getting rich because they were kind of acting like the mothers for the miners that were around. So they would cook for them. One woman made a ton of money and made a very, very rich salary just by making pies. That's all she did. She opened up a store and just made pies, and people bought them over and over and over and over again. In these boom towns, there was only one town near this mining stuff, and so the prices were marked way up. Like bottled water would be super, super expensive because all the water in the streams and stuff was polluted by the chemicals that they would use to try and locate the gold, like arsenic, which you guys know was a really nasty poison. The other type of people that were in the boom towns a lot were immigrants, and so these people were also coming out trying to find gold. And so you'd hear Irish accents, you'd hear Italian, German, Spanish, Chinese languages running around the towns of these, or the streets of these boom towns. And so with these towns growing up so quickly and getting to be towns almost overnight, they grew way too fast to set up any law and order, to set up, sheriffs or anything like that. And so what ended up happening is people mostly just made these groups of vigilantes. These people became vigilantes. And I know you've heard the word vigilante, maybe didn't know quite what it was, but a vigilante is someone who has no right to do it, but takes the law into their own hands. And so if somebody stole something from you, you might go out and attack them and steal something back, or maybe even kill them, whatever. Okay, the issue with the vigilantes is they usually took kind of an extreme punishment to the people. They wouldn't put them in jail. They were more likely to just kill someone or injure them or steal something back. Okay, and so vigilantes started to pop up all across the Wild West. And eventually in each of these towns, the law was set up, and there were sheriffs and marshals and judges and things like that. But oftentimes the vigilante kind of never wore out because they had already kind of set up. That's how they had operated before the sheriffs and the marshals and everybody was around. But then eventually in these towns, the ore ran out. So the gold ran out, the silver ran out, whatever they were trying to get ran out. And all of a sudden, everybody just left. All the miners would get up and go. They'd take whatever they could carry with them and go on to the next place. And so these boom towns very quickly turned into ghost towns. And we'll watch a little video in class about ghost towns. Another gigantic factor in bringing people out and populating the West was the railroad. And the railroad is huge. Before 1860, the railroad ended at the Mississippi River. When you were starting from the east, starting from New York and the East Coast, you could go all the way out to the Mississippi River, but then the railroad didn't go any further than that. And so the government decided, if we want the railroad to go out there, we're going to have to help the railroad companies out. And for every 1 mile of track that the railroad laid down, the railroad got to get 10 square miles of land. So every time they put down 1 mile, that meant that they got all of the land that the track was on, plus 5 miles on one side of the land and 5 miles on the other side of the track. They would get all of that land. And so they ended up with a bigger than Texas sized chunk of land, more than 180 million acres. And so that was a really, really big deal, and that's why the railroad started to get big really, really fast. Also, they would borrow money to the railroads. The government would borrow money to the railroads to be able to build it also. So it was a big, big money maker if you didn't mind the risk of putting up this railroad. And so they decided to build what's called the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Transcontinental Railroad is a railroad whose design was to go all the way across the continent. So they already had railroads, and I'll start drawing on this map here. They already had railroads all the way out to here. Okay. And so what they needed to do was create a railroad that went the rest of the way out to the Pacific Ocean. And so two men decided that they would do that. Okay. One of them was named Leland Stanford, and he started on this red one over here. Okay. And he started all the way in Sacramento, California on the east side, and he decided to move in, and he would meet up with the other side of it, and that was called the Central Pacific Railroad. Okay, and the Central Pacific Railroad was built, Leland Stanford was in charge of it, but it was mostly built by immigrants, and it was mostly built by the Chinese immigrants, and it was really, really difficult because they had to go through the Sierra Nevada mountains, and when they were going through there, they had to build huge bridges, they had to blast tunnels through it with explosives. It was a very dangerous and difficult job, and it was mostly done by the Chinese people. And then the Union Pacific was this blue one, and it's much longer, but it was an easier route because the only mountains they had to go over were the Rocky Mountains, and they kind of had ways through that where it wasn't as difficult to do as the Sierra Nevada mountains, but they laid a lot more track. Okay, and so that went from Omaha, Nebraska, which is right here, all the way out to the west, and then they were going to meet somewhere in the middle. And so this one was built also by immigrants, also by former slaves, all that kind of stuff. But the biggest immigrant population that built the Union Pacific Railroad was the Irish. And so the two railroads did eventually meet, and they met at a place called Promontory Point, Utah. And there was a big ceremony put together, and all the men who had built it, and the fancy men who had been the ones that were paying for it and all that, were there. And they set up a telegram so that they could send it word really quickly as soon as it was done out to New York, so that New York would know that there was now a connection all the way from New York all the way out to California. And so they did this, and Leland Stanford was the person who got to drive in the last spike. And the last spike that they drove in was a golden spike. It was made completely out of gold. And it was just kind of this big symbolic special thing. And so they put it down, they put this spike down, and Leland Stanford picked up the hammer, and he swung that hammer to knock the spike into the railroad and finish the railroad. And as soon as that hammer came down, the telegraph got sent out and it said done. The problem was it wasn't done because Leland Stanford had missed the spike, and so it took another 2 or 3 tries until somebody was able to drive in the spike. But it's just kind of a funny story because the big fancy guy who was paying for it and who got all the credit for making it, he couldn't even hit the the spike to drill it in. He needed the workers there to be able to help him out. So there was conflict with the natives for sure, and we're going to talk a lot about that. But just to talk a little bit about the natives, they were starting to change a little bit. Before the Europeans came over, there were no horses on the continent, so it's not like they were using horses very much. But now, by this time, they had started to use and become really, really good with horses. And so they were using horses. They also had gotten guns from the Europeans as well. Okay, and they were following the buffalo herds, hunting the buffaloes as they always had. And when they would kill the buffalo, they would use every single part of it and, you know, just continue to move around and follow this buffalo. Also in the native culture, the women had a much larger role. They would the men would go out and they would be warriors or hunters or whatever, and the women would kind of run the village while the men were gone. And so a lot of the day-to-day operations of the village happened or were done by the women. Okay, and so what the American government wanted to do is they wanted these people to stop moving around, because it was really hard to go out and claim land if these people were constantly moving from place to place to place to place. And so they signed the Fort Laramie Treaty with a bunch of the tribes, and they said if the natives settle permanently in one spot, they pick one spot and they stay there, then the government will protect that land. And they said they will protect that land as long as the grass shall grow, was the quote. And so as long as, you know, the grass keeps growing on the land and we're all good, then you guys get to keep that land. However, very, very quickly that treaty got violated because gold was found in the region that they had given away. And so other settlers, white people, started to move in and push the natives out, and then the natives had to move to you know, smaller and worse land over and over and over and over again. Okay, one example of this happening, well, as this was happening, I guess, some of the natives were fighting back. They were attacking supply trains, attacking white people's homes, doing all these different things. And because of these attacks, the army was out there trying to protect the white people and trying to kill the natives that were hostile. And so the Sand Creek massacre happened at this time. Colonel John Shivington, this man down in the bottom right corner, he was in charge of a small group of military and about 700 men, and he decided that he was going to attack a village. Okay, and so he attacked a village of Native Americans, but this native village were friendly to the American government, and they were under military protection. They were supposed to be protected by the army, but now the army was attacking them, and so they waved the white flag. They said, no, you don't need to attack us, we're friends, you know. And even though the white flag was being waved, John Shivington still sent his 700 men in and attacked this village. And about 100 men, women, and children were killed during this massacre for really no reason, because they were supposed to be protected at this time. And so the natives, the fight with the natives was kind of seen as a war, and for some of the tribes it was a war, but the natives were seeing all of these people that they were having to fight and all of these reasons that they had to fight. But one of the groups of people that they had to fight, they gave them a nickname, and they called them the Buffalo Soldiers. And the Buffalo Soldiers were the former slaves, the African Americans, who came out after the war was done, after the Civil War was done, and wanted to keep fighting, wanted that job, wanted the money that came along with that job of fighting out in the West. And so they were called the Buffalo Soldiers, and they really did a pretty good job fighting the Native Americans out in the West. Now, in the 1870s, the buffalo started to die out, and there was a big issue with the buffalo dying out because they were so easy to kill. And so the railroad used them for meat, and they fed all of their railroad workers. They would have these hunters go out and kill sometimes 2,000 buffalo per month for one hunter that was hired by the railroad. And so it was kind of a crazy amount of buffalo were being killed and fed to the people who were building the railroads. And as you remember, the natives were given these pieces of land. They were given these reservations. Okay, and these reservations, a reservation is land that's set aside just for the natives. And so what we gave them was a couple of different areas. We gave them Oklahoma, and we gave them the Black Hills area, were a couple of different areas. And so we picked the Oklahoma because it had really, really bad soil, which made farming really hard. So we saw it as kind of like worthless land, and so we gave it to them. Later on, we'd take it back, but we also gave them the Black Hills because the Black Hills was seen as kind of bad land. But then eventually, in the Black Hills in 1874, so not very much later, the they found gold out in that area. They found gold in the Black Hills, and so the miners came running in, the white people came running in, and a native man by the name of Crazy Horse led these attacks to try and drive the miners out. But eventually, that area also was taken back by the white people, even though it was the land that we had pushed the natives to and guaranteed them that they would be able to keep. And so continuing on, talking about these fights between the natives and the American army, this man up in the top right corner, his name is General George Custer. He was also one of the people who was in charge of the groups that were fighting the natives. And what they were trying to do was force those natives to get onto the reservations that they had picked. And so as they're trying to do this and attack them and do whatever else, they entered a place called Little Bighorn Valley in Montana. And they were outnumbered by a group of people, a group of Sioux and Cheyenne. But they still attacked them, and they ended up with the lower ground, and they got ambushed, and arrows rained in and bullets rained in from the sides, and they kind of had the low ground and didn't have any tactical advantage, any strategic advantage. Okay, and so what ended up happening is Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse were the name of the two native men, warriors, that were there leading the military or the warriors there, and they ended up killing Custer and every single one of his men as they ambushed him. Now, eventually, that was really one of the last big victories because there were just too many Americans to fight it anymore. Within 2 years after the Battle of Little Bighorn, it was basically done. There were still groups that fought, okay, and there were still groups that tried to get away, but they didn't last very long. The Nez Perce, which is that first one right here, okay, they had a chief with a really cool name. His name was Chief Joseph. Joseph's just a really cool name. But anyways, he decided that he didn't want his people to be humiliated anymore. And so him and his people decided to run to Canada where they could live a better life and not have to, fight against the American army and get defeated or be sent to reservations or whatever else. And so he ran into Canada, but he was cut off by the American military, and he was captured, and he had to sign a treaty. And he was kind of humiliated, and so one of his most famous quotes is, "I will fight no more forever," basically saying, you guys won, there's nothing we can do about it. The Apache and Navajos also fought in the American Southwest. One of the famous Apache men was named Geronimo, and Geronimo was kind of an interesting dude. He ended up getting captured a whole bunch of times, but he kept escaping the people that captured him. And so he escaped them like 3 times and just kept attacking the supply trains and attacking. So kind of interesting people, but they continued to fight for a little bit longer. So even though they didn't really have much of a chance to return to their old ways from fighting anymore, there was a man named Wovoka, and this is a picture of him up here. Okay, a man named Wovoka, and he was a prophet in the Native American culture, and he said that he'd spoken to the gods, and they had said that the ghost dance was the way to get everything back that they wanted, to get their old ways back. And so they said that basically that the ancestors, all their ancestors, everybody who had died before, and the buffalo would come back if they did this ghost dance. And they also said that the white people would be gone, would disappear, would leave, would whatever would happen to them, and they'd be completely gone. Okay, and so what they did is they tried to get a bunch of different tribes, a bunch of different people together to try and do this ghost dance, so that this would happen. And they got them all together, but the army soldiers kind of thought they were getting together to attack the United States and to attack the soldiers and fight back. And so they thought it was an uprising, and so they tried to get in there and stop it. And they decided to arrest Sitting Bull because Sitting Bull was one of these guys who had fought them before and who seemed to be kind of a leader in the area. As they were arresting Sitting Bull, he struggled and ended up being killed. And so to stop it from happening and to stop the fighting and try and get away from it, the Sioux ran away. And eventually the Sioux that ran away were surrounded by an army at Wounded Knee Creek. Okay, and so at Wounded Knee Creek, they were completely surrounded, and they had to start giving up their weapons, and they started to put their weapons down, and all of a sudden shots were fired. And after the shots were fired, everybody started shooting at each other, and about 200 native men, women, and kids were killed, and I think only about, I can't remember the exact number, but it was somewhere around like 17 Americans were injured or killed. Okay, and so a quote from one of the natives said, "A people's dream died there," basically saying this is the end. This is the true end of the native resistance. And so without any spirit left to fight, the government kind of kept going on its same exact cycle of, let's create a treaty and make peace with these people, then we'll violate it. Then we'll make another treaty, and then we'll violate it because we find gold, or we find that we want that land, or whatever other reason that we had for it. And so one of these that was created was the Dawes Act. And again, it's just trying to get the natives to settle down and stop moving around and stay in one place. And so they basically said, they took each native and they gave them 160 acres, and just gave it to them. And they decided they were also going to teach them to farm. And so they set up these schools to teach the people to farm, but also to teach the kids to assimilate, to become like Americans, to change into our culture instead of being like they were. Okay, and so they really wanted to end this wandering, so they gave them the farms. But the act failed because through a couple of different loopholes and things like that, the natives started to find white people who were wanting to buy their land, and the white people knew what the land was worth and offered really low prices, and the natives didn't know what it was worth and didn't have any value for the land, and so they sold them. And so a lot of the natives sold their land to these dishonest white people who were basically stealing from them. And really, this Dawes Act, this stopping of the natives from moving around the country, that was the end of Native American way of life, because the kids were assimilated into our culture, and the native culture kind of faded away. Okay? And so what it did is it created a culture in the of Native Americans being very poor and very dependent on the U.S. government at that time. About the same time, for many, many years, there had been wild cows, just wandering around, and wandering around the entire West. And what had happened is Spanish ranchers had brought their cows over, and they had been using them for meat and milk and whatever else. And some of them had gotten lost, had gotten out of the fences, whatever, and they started to populate the West and become wild cows, wild cattle. And so they would what ended up happening is people started to realize, well, all these cows out here, there's really not much reason to go and catch them all because we don't really have anywhere to send them or any way to send them. But with the railroads, now all of a sudden you could send them out to the east into New York and the big cities out there, and you could see that or you could sell them and make money off of them because those people would be buying them to eat. Okay, and so what they did is they hired these people, these cowhands, these cowboys. Okay, you've heard of cowboys before. to come out and to herd the cattle and get them all together and then move them over very, very long distances from one place to another. And so these cowboys would have to spend tons and tons of time. It was a very, very hard job. And so they honestly, they brought more than one horse so that they could have a fresh horse every day and the other horse could get a little bit of rest and just walk with the rest of the cows. And they might work for 18 hours a day and maybe make like $1 per day. And then it could be really, really dangerous because you might have to cross rivers or whatever. And it's possible that maybe lightning strikes or a storm hits and the cows all panic and try and run away from each other. And maybe something happens that makes the cows stampede and run in one direction out of fear where you can't move them in the direction you want them to, and it can get really, really dangerous. And so they moved them along these major trails that had been set up before. When they moved them along these major trails, at the end of them, people decided to establish cow towns. And a cow town was basically a boom town that wasn't near any type of mining or any type of gold or silver or anything like that, but it was just at the end of these big cow trails. And so the cowboys could come in and they could find some civilization. They could have a bath and hot meals and a bed to sleep in and all that kind of stuff. And so that was kind of the idea of the cowboy, were those people. And that's kind of what brought this idea of these Wild West people to, it was a myth. It wasn't real. Okay. And so it didn't last for very long. And really, these cowboys weren't out fighting Indians and doing stuff like that. They were mostly just getting cattle and moving them along. Right. However, Buffalo Bill was one of the people that really brought on this myth, and people liked the myth and they liked the legend that these people were out and fighting and doing all these different things. And so his name was William Cody. He's this guy right here, and we'll read about him more on Actively Learn. But he is, he was a former buffalo hunter named William Cody, and he took on that nickname of Buffalo Bill. And he set up a traveling Wild West show where he would go around from town to town and he would put on these exhibitions. He would show how good of a shot he was, or a really good horse rider or something like that. They do all these tricks with their guns and with their horse riding and with everything else, to show how amazing they were and how, this whole cowboy life, this whole cowboy myth that you guys have seen movies about and things like that. Okay. One of the people that was in his show is this girl right here. Her name was Annie Oakley, and she was a female sharpshooter and part of that Wild West show. So the government was trying to decide, how can we possibly promote farming? How can we make people try to farm and try and make people to spread out and use some more of this land? We had just a ton of land. Why can't we just make people use it? And so they created an act called the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act said you could keep a homestead, which was 160 acres of land, would be just given to you for free, and all you had to do was to work the land and improve it for 5 years. The problem was only about a third of the people that signed up for these homesteads could actually make it work, because you had to last for 5 whole years, and the 160 acres, that's too small to make enough food or make enough grain or make enough anything to really make much of a profit. So it's not like you were making a whole bunch of money there. You were just trying to survive. You may have to fight off natives in your place. You may have to deal with, you deal with weather, you deal with bugs, you deal with all the different things that a farmer has to deal with. And so it was kind of a difficult deal. But the railroads did help as well. They took some of that land that they had, that 180 million acres, and they gave it away to farmers. And why would they do that? That doesn't even make sense. Why would you, if you're getting rich off this land, why are you just giving it away? Why aren't you selling it? Well, they realized that with the farming, those farmers would have to take those grains, that corn or wheat or whatever else they had, and they would have to move it to somewhere where they could sell it, like out east. And so they would have to use the railroads, and instead of just taking that one-time money of people that are buying the farm, instead they wanted to bring farmers out there that would have to use their product for the rest of their lives. And so they get money forever instead of just one-time money. Okay, and so they'd constantly be making that money. And so farming in the plains was really, really difficult because there wasn't very much water, and so it was really hard to grow much of anything. And then there was also this grass that was there. And so because of that, the people that went out and tried to farm in the Great Plains were named the sod busters. Because what sod is it's grass, this really thick group of roots that are tangled in the soil. And so when you think about it, if any of you have ever taken a shovel and tried to dig a hole, the first little bit you have to kind of step on that shovel and really cut through, because that's the sod part. Okay, and it maybe is on regular grass like 3 inches deep or something like that, but we're talking in the sod busting times it might be 6 inches deep, a foot deep, maybe even 2 feet deep. Okay, and what it is, it's all these tangled roots. Okay, it's grass that are tangled up in the soil, and if there wasn't enough water, which there wasn't always very much rain, they would just turn into this hardened mass, almost like a brick. And so it was like trying to cut through a brick. And so that was a bad thing, but the good part about making these bricks is they didn't have very much wood to make their houses with. And so a lot of the people, as you can see in this picture up on top, made their houses out of sod. And so what they would do is they'd cut the sod out in like brick shapes, and they'd dry it out in the sun, and then it would become building material, become like a brick for their house. Okay. And so that they ended up cutting into this sod in order to do it, but it really had a really bad consequence of breaking their plows. So they could take a plow and pull it behind a horse, and it could set up their fields and make them ready to plant and do all that kind of stuff, but they break all the time in this sod. And so John Deere created something called the steel plow. And so the steel plow wasn't made out of iron, it wasn't easily breakable, it was much harder, much stronger, and so it could actually cut through this sod without having a whole lot of risk of breaking it. Another invention that would happen that helped these farmers a lot was the barbed wire. And barbed wire would help keep the cows, the wild cows and the other cows, out of it, so it wouldn't eat their grass that they were trying to grow, their wheat or their corn that they were trying to grow to make money off of. And so really keeping the cattle out, that these random barbed wire fences that were around, and you can see the picture on the bottom here, barbed wire fences that were around, they made it so that this free range cowboy type movement wasn't possible anymore. So that ended the cowboy movement. The barbed wire is kind of the invention that tamed the Wild West. Okay, and the type of people that were coming out there were a lot of different types of people, but a big part of them were exodusters, and exodusters were the African Americans who came out to Kansas in particular, trying to find opportunities, trying to make their life better, trying to make money or whatever else they could do. And there are about 70,000 exodusters who moved out to Kansas. And there were also the last rush for land happened in Oklahoma, which was supposed to be Indian territory, but it kind of got taken over. And they realized it was good cattle ranching land and things like that. And so a lot of the people wanted to go out there and do it. And so what they did is they said, on this certain day, we're going to fire off a gun. And once you hear that boom, you can go out there and you can claim your land and pick the land that you wanted. And so there were a group of people called the boomers who were just waiting, and they ran to the best land they could possibly get. But there were also a group of people called the Sooners who went in before that, illegally snuck across the border and found all the good land. And as soon as that gun went off, they said, "Oh, I'm here, this is my land." And so they claimed the best land themselves. And so Oklahoma's university, their football team, their mascot is called the Boomers and the Sooners. So the Boomer Sooner, just kind of a nod to the history of the state. So the problem with farming is you didn't have a whole lot of big cities out there that you could go and shop and see people and do things in. And so these farmers are really far away from each other, and they were super, super poor. And they also had to kind of borrow money to get the stuff that they needed, and all of a sudden the grain prices were low, and it was just, it was a bad situation. They had borrowed money and they couldn't pay it back anymore. And so they created something called the Grange. And the Grange originally was just a group of farmers who were trying to get together with people, with their neighbors, with the people close by, for social events, for fun things, for, lectures, someone would come and talk, or sewing bees, or dances, or whatever else they could come up with. But then in 1867, they formed a big group, a national group, and their idea was to try and get the same advantages as these huge rich farmers, who could buy things for quite a bit cheaper, and also especially the railroads and the warehouses would give them a much better price on it. When you think about it, if you go next door to Holiday and you buy a can of pop, it's going to cost you what, $1.25, something like that. Whereas if you buy an entire 12-pack of pop, you could do that for, depending at like Walmart, for like $2.50. So, you could get 2 cans of pop at that lower or that higher price, whereas you get 12 cans of pop at the lower price if you're willing to buy more all at once. Okay, and so it's the same idea. The big farmers were getting the better price, but what happened is the Grange was trying to come together to get the small farmers the same exact advantages. And so they created a lot of farm cooperatives. And so the farm cooperatives are a bunch of tiny little farmers who would get together and they'd pool all their money, and they would make these huge purchases, which would allow them to get that cheaper price. And eventually the Grange turned into work on a whole new political party to improve the lives of these farmers. And we'll talk about that on the next slide. The party that came of this was the Populist Party, and the Populist Party was a group mostly made of unhappy farmers, not really happy with how things were going, and labor union workers, people that were trying to improve factory work and work in the city as well. And so they wanted a few different changes. They wanted some reforms to how society worked. They wanted things to change. And so the first one was they wanted the government to own railroads, and so that there was no gouging. You couldn't charge the little guys more than the big guys. They also wanted an income tax to replace the property tax, because before the only taxes were from property, and so if you own more land, you had to pay more tax, which they thought was unfair because farmers have to own a whole lot of land. Whereas if you do an income tax based on how much money you make, that's a more fair way to do it. And then also they fought for an 8-hour workday to kind of help out those people in the cities. The other thing that they really, really wanted was something called free silver. And to explain free silver, you have to understand that the money supply was based on the amount of gold that the government had. So for every dollar that was out in the money supply that people had, the paper dollars, they could go in and change that for gold. They could change it for whatever amount of gold that would be worth. And so they had to have that gold to back it up. So the only way of making the money supply bigger was to find more gold. But what they wanted to do, the Populist Party wanted to do, was include silver too. They wanted free silver. So instead of just gold being included in the money supply, they wanted silver and gold. And the reason they liked that idea is because it would cause inflation. And so inflation means that the money would be worth less. And so prices would go up, you'd get paid more, but you would have to pay more for everything. So why would that be a good thing? Well, it's because a lot of these farmers, like I said, had debts. And so they owed money to people. And if they had to pay with money that was worth less, then really they were kind of paying less. So if you got paid more money, all of a sudden you got a big raise, but prices went up on everything, it didn't matter if new prices were up because you already borrowed that money at the old prices, and it would be cheaper to pay it back. And so they had a presidential candidate from Nebraska. His name was William Jennings Bryan, and he was an excellent speaker. Very, very good. And he ran for president using running around the country and using the Cross of Gold speech, talking about how we can't kill our farmers on a cross of gold. We can't hang our farmers on a cross of gold. He did lose the election of 1896 to William McKinley. So William McKinley was the next president, and William McKinley ended up keeping the gold standard. And at that same time, the Republicans kind of took over the government, but really they took on a lot of the ideas of the Populist Party. So even though the Populist Party wasn't still around, a lot of their ideas got put in with the Republican ideals.